Here we go. I wrote this book because I discovered that my mother's coming of age story included a three-headed Nazi monster, an underground munitions factory, and a drink called Sachlab. And that's what I want to tell you about today. My name is Rina Neiman. Sorry. There I am. I grew up in Newton, Massachusetts, which is outside of Boston, and that's me dressed as Queen Esther on Purim. It was probably my favorite outfit ever. My father, Dr. David Neiman, was an archaeologist, a rabbi, and a professor of Jewish theology at Boston College for 25 years. If anyone is interested, you can Google Dr. David Neiman, and there is a plethora of audio and video recordings of his lectures. But this is about my mother. My mother, Shulamit Dubno Neiman, was born in Tel Aviv in 1928, and she was a Sabra, the first generation to speak modern Hebrew as their native tongue. A sabra is the fruit of the cactus tree, and it's prickly on the outside, but sweet on the inside. It was also the name given to the children who were born on the Yishuv. Yishuv means settlement and referred to the Zionist Jewish colonies that were founded by the waves of immigrants fleeing rising anti-Semitism in Europe beginning in the late 1800s and other parts of the world. At the time my mother was born, the area was under the British Mandate of Palestine. Before that, it had been under Ottoman rule for 400 years. But to me and my sisters, she was our mommy. It was my sister Rachel and Becky and me in the corner trying to escape. But she was also a musician, and she sang and played the guitar, representing Israeli culture wherever we lived, and usually wearing one of these large dresses from a large collection she had of dresses made in Israel. She recorded one LP in 1970 called Shulamit and Two Guitars, and it featured folk songs from around the world, and she sang in 6 different languages. And what I remember is her practicing for hours in the living room with 2 male flamenco guitarists and holding her own. Unfortunately, my mother died when I was 11, and my siblings and I were too young and devastated to deal with any of her things. So her clothing, papers, photographs, and the dresses were all put away. Years later, when my father passed away, we pulled everything out of storage and uncovered this large collection of Yemenite, Arab, and Bedouin pieces. There were ones we recognized, but since my father had put everything away, we hadn't seen. This regal pantsuit was made by Yemenite Jewish embroiderers in Jerusalem at a salon called Esther Zeitz, that my mother had many pieces made there. And she wore this specific one when we lived in Rome. My father was invited. He was the first Jew on the faculty of the Gregorian University, which is one of the Vatican's universities. And he was invited at the time to lead a Seder at one of the large synagogues there. And there we were. My mother accompanied him on guitar, and we had my sisters and I, matching outfits. There was this one that I remember very vividly. It was one of our favorites, and it had matching pants to go with it. And I wasn't sure when I was doing this research when she bought it, and I asked my older sister, and she said, well, it had to be 1971 or before, because I drew her wearing it when we lived in Rome. So that's kind of part of that. We knew my mother played the piano when she was young, although when we were growing up, she exclusively sang and played the guitar. The piano was just for us to practice and for her to use for scales. This is the only photo we had of her playing the piano. And she's wearing this very elegant dress, and she must be about 16, is probably in the mid-1940s. But now for the first time, I uncovered the actual dress and saw the colors. And what's so interesting about this dress is that it's a really beautiful 1940s style dress that Katharine Hepburn might have wore in that style, but it's covered with this beautiful, very intricate Yemenite embroidery. And really an example of the Sabra style, which reflected this melting pot of East and West Jewish cultures. I always knew my mother dressed a little differently than the other moms in Newton. Other things I discovered, there were the papers, letters, and photos that we had never seen before. My mother's had an older brother who we never met. His name was Avraham, and he died before we were born. He was 2 years older than my mother, and it was clear to us growing up that it was a loss that she never recovered from. We knew certain things about him. We knew he was studying to be an architect in Haifa, and that he had been a member of the first Tel Aviv flight club and flew gliders. But when I went through this box, I found an autograph book of his from 1941, and inside I found one of his friends, a guy named Oded, who wrote about their flight club, whose motto was El Al, which then later became the Israeli Airlines. And you can see the pilot on the bottom there is breathing a sigh of relief because Hebrew pilots are admitted into the gates of Eden. And he is saying, phew. And then this, Avraham the pilot, falling out of a plane and dropping bombs on Nazis in Berlin. And this is 1941. So I discovered that my 15-year-old uncle was training for a future Jewish Air Force. I found my 20-year-old mother's ID card, reflecting a joy that at the same time I recognized but was unfamiliar with. And then there were photos and photos of friends whose names I'd never know or how they have impacted her life. But most significantly, I found inside a discolored manila envelope a book. It was called Tiula Galil, and which means Trip to the Galilee. And it was a book that my uncle, her brother Abraham, wrote and illustrated about a trip that the two of them took through the Galilee in 1947. And what they did was they went from sea to the sea, from the Sea of Galilee to the Mediterranean Sea. And inside I found my 19-year-old mother. And she's waiting at the Tel Aviv bus station, and it's exactly as I remember it when I was 19 and lived in Israel. And she's annoyed at her brother because he's late. And this is actually like a 30-page book, but I'll show you a few of the pages. Here she is on the banks of the Sea of Galilee, Lake Kinneret, and she's complaining, again, because the rocks are hurting her feet. And here she is on the bow of a boat with her brother Abraham, and when she's told that the sea is too rough for them to go out, she says, "I'm not afraid of anything." Drunk, my 19-year-old mother, drunk on kosher wine at the Rishon LeZion winery that was built by Baron Rothschild in the late 1800s. But the last page really brought it home for me. It's the brother and sister in a loving embrace. And the text roughly translates as, "And here we finish our trip, and we'll say goodbye and see you later. And don't cry," and 3 dots. "And buried there a deep idea, and see you later. Next year in Italy or the USA. And again, see you later. And a kiss and 3 dots. And then I found this photo taken on that trip, and I knew it was all true. You have to understand, I never knew my mother as an adult. And here, all of a sudden, I have an intimate portrait of her at 19 by the person who knew her best in the world, which was her brother Abraham. And I decided that I wanted to write the story of this trip. But as I began, I realized that it was bigger than just my mother's and her brother's story. It was really a story about the Sabra generation. So I began to research it, her story, for the first time. First to the Yishuv was my maternal great-grandfather, Saba Dubno, Hanoch Dubno. And here he is in a canteen in Jerusalem in 1917 with his friends, and they are clearly enjoying themselves. Then came my grandfather, my mother's father, Yaakov, and his brother Yehoshua. And this is a picture of them with their cousins. Around the same time, my mother's mother came, and she came from a town in Poland called Ripin, which is on the border near Germany. In Ripin, she went to Hebrew school, here she is, and trained with her Zionist youth group. Most of the Jewish population in Ripin left, and those that stayed, unfortunately, perished in the Holocaust. So my grandfather and grandmother, Yaakov and Rachel, met on the Yishuv, and they were married on the beach in Tel Aviv. My grandfather and his brother lived and worked with local Arab crews, building the infrastructure. For years, they worked on the road from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. And I was told they were proud Zionist pacifists. This is my mother, her brother, and their father, with a local crew. We knew that my mother lived in Nazareth for a little time while they were building the road, but then they eventually ended up in Tel Aviv at 45 Melchett Street, which is in central Tel Aviv. And this is a typical Bauhaus architecture of that era in Tel Aviv. I wanted to give you a little background, a history of Tel Aviv. Tel Aviv was founded in 1909 by a group, several dozen families, and they purchased this land just north of Jaffa, Yafo, which has been a city for over 4,000 years. They purchased the land when it was under Ottoman rule, and this is it in 1909, and then 30 years later, this is what it looked like. And Tel Aviv was always planned to be a modern Jewish city. The first mayor, Mayor Dizengoff, commissioned the Scottish urban planner, Patrick Geddes, to design a garden city. So the streets, many of the streets around Tel Aviv are lined with trees, or they end in playgrounds and gardens. Now, starting with the election of Hitler in the early 30s, thousands of German Jews lost their jobs and moved to the Yishuv. So there was this huge influx of professionals, doctors, lawyers, musicians, and architects. And Tel Aviv became incredibly cosmopolitan. I discovered events in Tel Aviv that I realized my mother must have experienced, but I had no knowledge of. One of those was the Ad Lo Yada parade. This was a huge parade, carnival parade, that went from the late 1920s until 1936. It's been revived later, but that was the primo time for this event. And basically, thousands of people, they estimate in 1934 that 50,000 people came to Tel Aviv to watch this parade, and it just became the sea of humanity. And there were floats, there were balls afterwards, dancing, and there were all kinds of pageants showing the story of Purim and a parade, and as well as evils reflected that were brewing in Europe at the time. And I'm going to do my first reading. This takes place in 1934 at the Ad Lo Yada parade. Shula is 6 years old, and her brother Abraham is 8 years old. The parade stretches down Allenby Street as far as she can see. Each float is alive with people, music, and decorations. Now we see the great Zionist economic dream, fresh eggs and Agfa film. Is this what we're celebrating? I thought it was Purim. Meir is back on the balcony, a full glass in his hand. Lord, would you look at that? Avram says as he points down the street. Shula follows her brother's fingers and sees a massive three-headed dragon protruding from the throng. The green monster is at least 2 stories high. And as it inches its way up the street, the mammoth heads bob up and down as a man pulls the long ropes tied to its necks. The noise of the crowd grows louder as the creature moves towards them. The monster's bulging eyes and wide open mouth scare her. It's the Nazi monster, says Abraham, and only then does she see the swastikas that cover the monster's back and adorn the uniform of the driver. What, no Hitler this year? Meir says. Last year, the Mandate's German ambassador complained that the Nazi float was insulting to her chancellor, Yaakov says. Meir wobbles as he holds out a glass of clear liquid to Leah. She pours water from a small pitcher, and the fluid turns white. Shula's never seen water turn to milk before. She'll have to ask Abraham about it later. Insulting? That bastard? Meir says and takes a long sip of his drink. He wipes his lips and some drops spill from the glass. That anise scent again. That son of a bitch is not only making it hard for Jews in Germany, but now he makes it hard for us here. The Germans are flooding in and making it impossible for us to work or find homes. But Meir, that's why we're here, so that Jews will have a place to go to when things, when things go bad where they are? But what about people like me and my family? We never left. We've been here for generations. And now my sister can't afford to live in the neighborhood where we grew up. The rents are sky high and they say that things will only get more expensive. Meir drains his glass and looks into the bottom of his empty cup. Splat, splat. Raw eggs hit the giant. The driver pulls back on one long neck and then another. Egg yolk drips down the side of the beast, and the roar of the crowd grows louder. Another event that was very significant that my mother must have experienced happened in 1940. It was World War II, and the Italians were based in Ethiopia, and they were fighting the British who controlled the Yishuv. And normally they bombed the ports, but on September 9th, 1940, the Italian Air Force dropped 32 bombs on my mother's neighborhood. I interviewed a friend of my mother's who lived in the same place at the time, and she drew me a picture of the area. And if you can see, there's 2 bombs at the bottom of the page of the 32, and Melchett Street, where she lived, is 2 blocks away. So this was an awful tragedy. 137 people were killed, including 53 children, and a mass funeral took place the next day. And my next reading, I'm going to give you the story of that day. So this is September 9th, 1940 in Tel Aviv. Shula is 12 years old, and she now has a little younger brother named Yisrael, who's 2 years old. Yisrael's awake, Rachel yells from the kitchen. Shula pushes herself up from the piano. Since his birth 2 years ago, she's been helping with her baby brother's care. Most days she doesn't mind, but sometimes she would rather not have to interrupt her piano practice, homework, or letter writing with naps, baths, and feedings. She finds him sitting up in his crib, rubbing one eye with the back of his hand. He holds out his arms to her, and she picks him up. Laying his head on her shoulder, he then rubs his face back and forth against her neck. In the kitchen, Rachel dries her hands and takes the baby in her arms. Get the tub ready while I feed him, Shula, then you can give him a bath. Shula hurries to the bathroom and, taking the zinc tub out from under the sink, places it in the bathtub. She swirls the water around with her hand to make sure the hot and cold mix. As her mother enters the room, Shula holds out her arms to take Yisrael when she loses her balance as the floor falls out from under her. Ima, she cries, grabbing the edge of the tub. A second blast knocks her to the floor. Glass rains down on them as the windows burst inwards. An invisible hand punches her body. Yisrael screams. Blood on his face. Ima! She tries to scream, but she can't unclench her teeth. A high-pitched tone rips through her head, causing a stabbing pain in her ears. Rachel screams at her, but Shula can't hear what she's saying. Another bomb shakes the building, bringing her to her hands and knees. A wave of water splashes across the floor, soaking her as she scrambles over to her mother. Yaakov, Rachel screams. Shula barely hears her. Her father rushes into the room. Stay down, he yells, and covers them with his body. Only then does she realize the blasts are receding. Yalla, everyone up, we're getting out of here. He grabs Yisrael in one arm and pulls his wife up with the other. Rachel stops. Tears stream down her face, and the baby is crying. Shula can see her mother say Abraham and her father answering, but all she hears is a loud ringing. Hurrying to the front door, she's shocked at the damage to their home. Glass shards cover the floor in front of each window. Books, chairs, and knickknacks are scattered across the floor. Looking up, she sees a long crack in the ceiling from one end of the room to the other. They leave footprints in the plaster dust covering their way. Yaakov jerks open the front door and ushers them down the stairs. They run into their neighbors, Ephraim and Esther Horowitz, on the ground floor landing. Thank God you're safe, Esther says, hugging Shula and kissing Yisrael on the cheek. Yaakov, what the hell happened here? Ephraim yells, and Shula hears him. The ringing is subsiding. They huddle by the wall of the Horowitz's ground floor terrace. Bewildered, dust-covered neighbors from the surrounding apartment buildings fill the streets. A black column of smoke rises in the distance. The smell of burning dust fills her nostrils. The building on the street looks fine until she notices that all the windows are gone, blown out by the blasts. Where's Avraham? Esther asks Rachel, who looks at Yaakov and bursts into tears. He's fine. He's at a friend's house studying. Once we know it's safe, I'll get him, Yaakov says as he puts his arm around his wife. A distant rattling silences the street. Worry covers the adults' faces. It makes her nervous. Her throat is dry. My sisters and I knew my mother worked in a munitions factory before the War of Independence, and we knew she didn't like potatoes because that's what they had to eat. But that's really all we knew. But after going through the box of photos, I discovered that she was also a soldier. Spending years with her scout troops in Tel Aviv, with Sofim, preparing for a war that they knew was going to come. And for my last reading, I'll read a scene that takes place in this underground munitions factory. It's February in 1948, and Shula is 20 years old. Shula waits by the kibbutz's laundry building like she has every morning for the last 2 weeks. Young men and women slowly join her, all dressed for the heat in short pants and shirts. The scent of fresh baked bread wafts across from the bakery along the way. Long rows of white shirts dry on clotheslines, connecting the two structures like tentacles. The supervisor approaches, his black hair short and neat. He breaks apart a fresh loaf of bread and distributes it among them. Boker tov, good morning, he says. Some British soldiers are here with shirts to launder. Let's walk over here until they leave. Walking towards a row of apple trees, she breathes in the crisp morning air, closes her eyes and lets the sun shine on her face. It feels so good, so right. She wants to hold on to this feeling, the warmth of the sun on her skin, the sounds of the birds chirping in the trees, the smell of the fresh grass. She pulls a branch to her nose and sniffs the light pink blossom. Doesn't really smell right, the supervisor says. No, not really, but it looks nice, she answers. He plucks the flower from the branch and hands it to Shula. Keep it with you today, and maybe things won't seem so bad. A few minutes later, the British soldiers U-turn in a cloud of dust and drive off in their Jeep. Looks like we can go to work now, he says, and they head back to the laundry. Inside the cement block structure, 3 large round washing machines churn. The sound of metal scraping metal is deafening. Steam erupts from a huge boiler. A woman at a large sink rubs a shirt back and forth against a soapy metal washboard. The foreman, a big, strong man with a shock of thick white hair, nods as they file into the building. He wears a faded blue work shirt that pulls against his barrel chest. A cigarette dangles from his mouth. Even in the middle of the desert, the Brits walk around like they just left a fancy nightclub, he says, throwing the white shirts into a basket. Did you see any giraffes out there? Giraffes are the kibbutz members who are oblivious to the work being done under their feet. The supervisor shakes his head. Then let's get to work. The two men walk over to a large washing machine. And with one pushing from behind and the other pulling from the front, the huge barrel swings to one side, revealing a man-side hold beneath it. The supervisor waves his hand and motions to them. They have 3 minutes to get their group down the ladder. Her stomach tightens as she looks into the hole. Loud metallic banging overtakes the roar of the washers. Her mood darkens. She sighs and sticks the apple blossom behind her ear. Try to keep it alive, okay? The supervisor says. She manages a thin smile, then hand over hand, makes her way down the ladder. When she reaches the bottom, she puts her earplugs in, looking up as the giant washer seals the hole. The long underground room is hot and cramped, the noise ear-splitting. She passes the machines that line the right-hand wall, each one operated by one of the 45 volunteers in her shift. Today, she's assigned to work on the far end of the room. She walks by the machines that press, stretch, trim, shape, wash, and pull the metal, each one a step in the bullet-making process. Like every day for the past year, this underground facility will produce thousands of bullets for the British-made Sten gun. Fittingly, these 9mm parabellums got their name from the Latin, if you seek peace, prepare for war. 2 weeks ago, she was amazed by the secret munitions factory. Finally, she was supporting the war effort in a real way. For a week, she was happy, singing at the top of her lungs like each worker did, following their own melodies together under the deafening noise of the machine. Then after a week, her mood shifted. This was not for her. She dreaded the metallic banging of the machines, hated the smell of chemicals and burning metal, hated the work that was ruining her fingertips. Would she still be able to play the piano? The lack of sunlight wore her down. She developed a newfound hatred for potatoes, the one thing they had to eat down in the dungeon, as she called it. The days were 12 hours of hell, with the assaultive noise of not only the machines, but the constant rat-tat-tat of Sten guns firing in the underground testing range. And even though she stuffs her ears each day with a mix of wax and cotton wool, every night she falls asleep to the same incessant ringing. She pours gunpowder through a narrow funnel into the bullet casing, then tamps them down. She fills a box and moves it over to the next station where the tips are put into place. From there, they're packed into bigger crates that line the far side of the workshop. A woman stands at a nearby table, painting stencils on the top of large wooden boxes that read fragile, handled with care, light bulbs. Sometime after a potato break, she never calls it lunch since it's always the same no matter what, the foreman signals her to follow him to the closet. Inside is a stool and a large light fixture. The foreman points and Shula sits. She sips from her canteen as the man pulls a string, turning on the bulb. Ultraviolet light from the sunray lamp fills the tiny space. She leans back against the wall. 20 minutes, the foreman yells, and don't fall asleep. Shula looks at her watch and takes another sip of her water. Her first week of work here, a girl fell asleep in the sunroom, as they call it. When they found her an hour later, only one side of her face had been exposed to the light, leaving half her face bright red, the other half white. After that incident, the supervisor lectured them on the room's proper use. We are trying to blend in and look like people who have been working in the sun all day, not like clowns in the circus, he admonished. She leans her head back against the wall and feels her face warm. Closing her eyes, she imagines the sun on her face, the smell of the trees, the light breeze on her skin. Fingering the apple blossom behind her ear, she takes it out and smells. No, there still isn't a smell, but at least the flower's alive. She puts a drop of water from the canteen on the tip of her finger and dips the stem in, then sticks it back behind her ear. She is hot, the air is stifling, the noise is deafening, and if she never sees another potato in her life, that would be a blessing. So that concludes the presentation. You can learn more about my mother's story in the book, Born Under Fire, and it's available for sale on Amazon. And I also have a lot of resources and other information on my website. at bornunderfire.com. And now I will take any questions. Hold on, I'll get back to my screen. Okay. All right. You have questions. Great, here I am. You can send them to me via the question app. Let's see. Hello, Laura Kaplan. Aloha. I'm so glad you are here. Well, if there's no questions, I am, oh, here's one, hold on. Where did you find the photos? The photos, a lot of them are from my mother's collection that she had. Like I said, she had put away for years. Others I found during my research and online or in other places, and from family members as well. Okay, no? Would love to be able to do this presentation for any schools out there. If you think this would be valuable to your students, please give me a email. Okay, hold on, I got some more here. Oh, hold on. Sorry, there's two places where you can put questions. Nico wants to know if your mom spoke or sang Ladino. She sang a lot of songs. She didn't speak Ladino, but she collected folk songs from around the world, and then she also specialized in Jewish music from around the world. And so, yes, Ladino was something that she sang a lot in. Where did I grow up? I grew up in Newton, Massachusetts, which is outside Boston. We used to go to Israel starting when I was about 3. My father led archaeological digs for Boston College, and we would spend the summer there. So pretty much from 3 to probably 10 or 11, I went every year. And then we did spend a year there when I was in 5th grade. Thank you. Love the book, Being a Dubno Myself. Thank you for filling in the portions of the family history I never knew. Thank you, Phyllis. I'm so glad you were able to join. Yes, the Dubnos are a large family who are spread across the world in different areas. Do you have an Israeli passport? We loved your presentation. I am not, well, you know, that's a complicated question, Laura, and I can talk to you about that later. All right, any other questions? Thank you for joining. Oh, I have another question, hold on. No? Well, thank you everyone for participating. I really appreciate it. You can always email me if you have other questions. What did you think of the research process? Hello, India. I'm so glad you could join. It was fascinating. I really learned so much, not only about what my mother experienced in her life, which was really what I was trying to get to the bottom of, having not known her as an adult, but also finding out about all these different things, like I said, events that happened, you know, what life was like, especially in Tel Aviv, which was just such an anomaly of a city and still is. One of the most wonderful places in the world. And I enjoyed it. I loved doing the research. And of course, India, you helped me so much. So thank you. All right. Well, thank you all for joining me. Again, send me any questions if you do. Much appreciated. And stay safe and stay well, everyone out there. Thank you. Oh, hold on. No, got all those questions. All right. Thanks. Bye-bye.